Example 1 factor. So in part A, we have negative 4x squared plus 24x. We have to determine what the greatest common factor would be for these two terms. So you're going to consider the numbers 4 and 24. The largest number that you can divide 4 and 24 by is 4, so that's going to be part of our greatest common factor. Also, since the first term starts with a negative, we have to have that as part of the greatest common factor. You also have to consider the variables here. We have 1x that's kind of going to be common in the first and second term. So negative 4x is the greatest common factor that can be removed. Now to determine what goes inside the brackets here, we have to divide each of these terms by our greatest common factor of negative 4x. So negative 4x squared, when divided by negative 4x, leaves us with 1x. Alternatively, you can think of what you need to multiply negative 4x by to give you negative 4x squared, and that's an additional x. Okay. To get the second term, we can take 24x and divide by negative 4x, which would give us negative 6. So this would be the factored form. I just removed a common monomial factor of negative 4x. Now you can always check your work by expanding back. So negative 4x times x is negative 4x squared, and negative 4x times negative 6 is 24x. Okay, let's look at part B. In part B, we have two terms here, and we have to determine the greatest common factor. And we can see that x plus 1 is a common binomial factor here that we can remove. So we're going to write that first in front of the second set of brackets, and then to determine what goes in those brackets, we're going to divide each of these terms by x plus 1. So if I have 4x multiplied by x plus 1 and I'm dividing out on x plus 1, I'm left with 4x. And then if I take 5 times x plus 1 and I divide out at x plus 1, I'm just left with that positive 5. So this would be the final answer. And I removed a common binomial factor from these two terms. In part C, it doesn't look like we have any kind of common factors, so we're going to try factoring this by grouping. We can group the first two terms together and the last two terms together. They should have something in common. So here we have x's in common, here we have a factor of 5 in common. Okay, so we grouped them and we take out the greatest common factor from each one. So aside from the x here, we can also factor out 3, leaving us with 2x plus 1. In the second pair, the greatest common factor is just going to be 5 because there aren't any variables here, so we can't have any variables that are common to both terms. And please make sure that you write plus here, positive 5. If you don't include this plus, it changes the expression and it won't be equivalent to the one above it. Okay, so we're going to factor out a positive 5, leaving us with 2x plus 1. And now we can see that we have 2x plus 1 as a common binomial factor that we can remove. So writing that first in front of the second bracket, we end up with 2x plus 1, and then dividing both of these two terms by 2x plus 1 leaves us with 3x plus 5, and that would be the factored form. Okay, last example. Again, it doesn't look like there's anything common to all four terms, so we can group them. Now I know it doesn't look like there's anything common between these two terms, but 1 or negative 1 can always be factored out. So keeping that in mind, for the first pair of terms, we're going to factor out x squared, leaving us with x plus 1. And here, the only thing that's common is 1. We can factor out a 1, and it's a positive 1 that we're going to factor. Dividing these by x plus 1 will still leave us with x plus 1. Then x plus 1 is seen as our common binomial factor. We're going to remove that, and that will leave us with x squared plus 1 in the remaining bracket. So this should be a review from last year. Any of the factoring that we do is just a quick review of factoring that we're going to need to use for subsequent sections.